Gallery, you were asking about the origins of archetypal astrology and archetypal cosmology, and I'll try and differentiate those terms because they're often used interchangeably, and I think for good reason. Archetypal astrology principally came out of the work of Richard Tarnas, who wrote a well-known book called The Passion of the Western Mind. I think it came out in 1989, something like that, which is a narrative history of the Western worldview, and not at all about astrology, but he then followed that up in 2006 with another book called Kosmos and Psyche, which is explicitly about astrology, chiefly an analysis of cultural history and looking at correlations between planetary movements, cycles, and alignments, and what was happening in the world at particular times in correspondence with the alignments. So that book really officially launched archetypal astrology, but years before, Tarnas was at Esalen Institute in California with Stanislav Grof, and they were looking for a way to help them understand why, when people would come into Esalen and having their non-ordinary state of consciousness, psychedelic often or breath work initiated experiences, why one person would have a dark night of the soul experience and someone else might have a kind of blissful visions of Buddhist heavens or something very contrasting, given that the set and the setting were identical, and if it's LSD, then the dosage was identical. And they couldn't understand every method they used, every form of psychological test didn't prove to be helpful at all. And then they used to have astrologers come into Esalen to give talks. I think I remember Tana saying at some point, well, kind of last resort, we'll try astrology. And so they looked at people's transits, like what was happening in the sky at the time someone was having an experiential session, and how did that relate to that person's birth chart? That's what transits are, personal transits. And they found that they could do that, and they could look and say, well, one person had a Saturn transit to Neptune, which is more inclined to like a dark night of the soul, or at least experiences of paranoia and doubt, loss of faith, that kind of thing. And another person might have had a Jupiter transit to Uranus, which is more to do with like peak experience, like heights, sudden revelations. And so they found that using astrology, it proved to be a better predictor than anything else that they tried. And I remember Tana saying, ironically, that the astrology was even more controversial than what the research they were doing with psychedelics, right? So that's really where archetypal astrology began. Rick Tarnas wrote a book called Prometheus the Awakener, which came out, I think it was 87, something like that, just about the planet Uranus, the archetypal meaning of the planet Uranus, seen through the Prometheus myth of Greek mythology. And then Kosmos and Psyche, as I said, came out in 2006. I was studying with Rick Tarnas at that time in San Francisco at CIAS, and a few of us felt that it would be good to have like a more formal academic discipline around this, and that archetypal astrology was sufficiently distinct from other forms, even psychological astrology, like Liz Green and Stephen Arroyo and those kinds of people. It's more empirical, like it looks at historical correlations, or looks at the lives of famous figures, things that you can reference externally, rather than just astrologers telling you what a particular planet means, like in a sign or in a house. There's nothing wrong with that, but archetypal astrology, more empirical, and it's grounded in like a theoretical framework, Platonic understanding of forms, ideas, as like something like archetypes, pervading and informing, structuring the whole of reality, inner and outer, not just in the mind, but also chiefly a Jungian understanding of archetypes as instinctual, mythic principles and powers that pattern the unconscious, and then it has a mythic element too. So we felt that it would be good, given that it the kind of substantiality of this approach to astrology to have a discipline emerge around this. So I had the idea with Rod O'Neill to set up a journal, and ultimately we created Archai, an ancient term, something like Archetypes, Archai, the Journal of Archetypal Cosmology. And by Archetypal Cosmology, we use that term to designate the academic discipline, as it were. So not only the astrology piece, doing charts and looking at transits, the practice, but also the worldview, like drawing on, as I said, Platonism and Hegel, and new paradigm sciences, transpersonal psychology, chiefly the psychology of Stanislav Grof, James Hillman's archetypal psychology, together, of course, with Jung's understanding of archetypes, psychoid, the idea that archetypes are not only within us, but somehow informing nature and matter as well. And so pulling all this together in the worldview, the cosmology. And so that's where we got the idea of archetypal cosmology from. So the journal Archai is centered on that, and it has sections that deal with theory and sections that deal with more the application, more the practice of astrology. So that's the distinction: archetypal astrology, the practice, and archetypal cosmology, the containing discipline, a field, as it were.
That's brilliant. I had no idea about that, and I think it's really helpful to understand the distinctions, but how they're related to each other. How one is a worldview and the other is more of an empirical practice, validating that worldview.
Yeah. I think that's a good kind of short way to summarize the difference. And obviously, in creating that Archai, the journal, and on the back of Rick Tarnas's Cosmos and Psyche, and then I wrote the Archetypal Cosmos in 2010, came out in 2011 in the US. On the back of that, we had hopes that we might give astrology more credibility, and I don't think anyone was under an illusion that it was going to be widely accepted, but at least for people who are open to that kind of cosmological perspective in relation to understanding the psyche and spirituality and so forth, that those kinds of people would have something they could go to. And I don't think there's another journal like Archai that tries to kind of walk that line between spiritually informed experiential insight, working with archetypes, and the theoretical worldview, as you said.
Yeah, and it's so important that be done, because one thing that we've observed as we've been building Kosmos Institute is the way that in traditional academia, that spiritual or personally experienced spirituality dimension is often excised from the coursework and even from the general purpose of the the course of education that students are enrolled in. And so bringing that back into the processes of educating ourselves seems pretty important.
Yeah, and I think the stuff that you're covering, the material you're covering at Cosmos Institute, it's things that have been pushed to the boundary of what's acceptable academic investigation. I mean, if you just look at Jungian psychology alone, astrology, alchemy, synchronicity, the deep psychospiritual meaning of myth, mystical experiences, psychopathology, virtually everything Jung looked at was in some ways taboo academically. And so he was trying to look into the irrational, as it were, to compensate for the shortcomings of the rational scientific mindset. And we're probably more there than ever, given the dominance of science in our time. Science and technology sorely need that. So I think the work that you're doing, bringing those perspectives into the foreground for people who want and need that, I think it's really valuable.